I was sitting in my office on February the 27th. The year was 2011. It's hard to believe that much time has passed since this happened because it just seems like yesterday that I came to this realization. I was doing what I always do first thing in the morning. I have a news aggregator on my phone, and I'm flipping through stories that have to do with things that I'm interested in. Biblical things, Christian things, tidbits, trivia that I might find interesting or might spur an article or a sermon idea, illustration, so forth. And I remember seeing a news article, February 27, 2011, that changed the way I thought and I think yet today. You see, on that day, there was a man by the name of Frank Buckles who died, and he died at the age of 110. Now, he wasn't in national news because of his age, per se. There are people that have lived longer than that. That's not a record of any sort. It is a long time to live, but that's not why it was so compelling. The reason that he was in the news that day is because he was the last living veteran of World War I. And I couldn't believe that. I was just like, wait, really? The last one? And I got to think, 1914, this is 2011. I guess so. Wow. I mean, it just snuck up on me. I didn't even see that happening. I found that hard to believe because I grew up in a small town in Chester, West Virginia. We had about 2,500 people that lived in this town, and we had one main street that went downtown. And did you not, if you lived in small towns, have these Memorial Day parades and Veterans Day parades? And did those soldiers not march down the middle of the street? And I remember as a high schooler watching the World War I vets go, and the World War II, and the Korean War, and Vietnam, and they would walk down and parade in the streets, and then it just hit me, there are no more World War, they're gone. And it just happened. It was I remembered those parades as if they were yesterday, and now today there are no more. They're gone. That just, caused me to sit back and take a look at really how fast life moves on. And then I began to think in terms of some spiritual things, and I began to think of people who were influential in my life as I sat there that morning in terms of preaching. I thought of men like, Johnny Ramsey. Many of you would have known Johnny Ramsey or knew Johnny Ramsey. Johnny Ramsey was a good friend of my dad's, and consequently he took an interest in me, encouraged me in a lot of ways, gave me tons of books, just said things that made me, as a very young preacher, think, I was just impressed that he even would pay me the time of day. And I thought of Hugo McCord. I didn't know Hugo McCord like probably most of you knew Hugo McCord. I was a freshman at Freed-Hardeman, and he came back and spoke in chapel one day. It was his 50th class reunion, 50th year. And he was president of his class at Freed-Hardeman. And he came back and he told us in chapel what it was like to go to school 50 years earlier. And boy, it was different. I learned that. The girls and guys couldn't even, be together, for most of the day. But one of the things, he stayed over and he preached that Sunday. And he preached one of those all scripture sermons I'm sure that many of you have heard. Blew me away. I couldn't believe it. And I want to preach like that when I get older. I just was amazed by him. And then I think of Winford Claiborne. He preached for a number of years on the International Gospel Hour. He was one of my teachers in school, and when we got out of school, or when I got out of school, I continued a friendship with him, and he was one of my mentors through the year. When my wife and I were married, we sat with him and had premarital counseling with him, and he gave me some advice that I was concerned about at a point in my life, which way to go with possibly moving, and he gave me advice that changed my life for the better. And he was a great friend. And then there's, of course, my dad. Nobody has influenced me as much as he has. Dad preached 50 years for the church in Chester, West Virginia, that particular congregation. And he has helped to mold and shape me into who I am today. But what all those men have in common is that they're no longer here. And they too have passed like that. It came to mind that all these men that had shaped who I am, they're no longer here. They're gone. Just like Frank Buckles in the World War I generation is gone, so are a lot of preachers that have meant the world to me. And that left me to think this: who's going to step up and take their place? And it won't be long, and it'll be sooner than we all realize, that we too will be gone. And who will step up and take our place? The theme that I've been given, or the title of this lesson, is Passing the Baton, Unfinished Business. And I want us to consider that. What are we going to do? To whom will we pass the baton? And what are we doing to make sure that that's done? You know, a generation can fail at this. It's happened in the past, and it can happen again. If you want to turn in your Bibles to Judges chapter 2 and verse 10, I'm sure you remember the passage. But there's this generation of people just after the generation of Joshua. Joshua brings the children of Israel into the promised land. What a celebration. What an awesome thing to see the power of God as he parts the waters of the Jordan River, and they march in and march around Jericho, and the walls of Jericho fall down, and all this miraculous manifestation that God is with them. And that generation, they die. And another generation arose who did not know God, nor the works of God. And I find that hard to believe. How can the generation of Joshua allow their children to grow up and not know either God or the works of God? How could they not have told their children about what had happened in that wilderness wandering? How that their parents didn't have to wear shoes or change shoes. They stayed good for 40 years, their clothes. They were provided for with water and manna from heaven. The walls of the Red Sea parted and they crossed on dry ground. All these stories that would wow us. That generation didn't know the works of God. How can that be? And if you don't know the works of God, well, then it's no surprise that they didn't know God, didn't have a relationship with him, because that would just, how do you have a relationship with somebody that you don't even know? You know nothing about. That must be an anomaly, right? No. I have a friend who went to visit a sister who was supposedly a Christian. She had a teenage, he was 11, I think, almost a teenage son. And one morning, this man was having breakfast with his nephew. And something came up in the course of the conversation, and he said something about like Jonah and the whale, or Jonah and the great fish. And the boy said, "What?" And he said, like Jonah and the fish. He said, "Jonah and the fish?" He said, "Do you not know what I'm talking about?" And he said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." He said, "You don't know the story of Jonah being swallowed by a great fish? That Jonah was running from God on a ship? You don't know that?" He said, I don't know what you're talking about." That boy's mother was a Christian. And he had never heard the story of Jonah and the great fish. It could be that we're raising a generation of biblically illiterate children. That generation of Joshua's day who didn't take the time to teach his own and their own children, maybe that could be said of us today. One of the most amazing things, and I wrote an article about it not too long ago, but did you know that Shakespeare couldn't read? How can it be that Shakespeare couldn't read? I mean, he's the greatest English author of all time. Everybody recognizes him as the greatest English writer of all time. But Shakespeare couldn't read. I didn't say which Shakespeare. William Shakespeare could read, but his daughter Judith could not. When it came time for her to sign her wedding certificate or marriage license, she put an X. How? How in the world can the greatest writer of all time have children who don't know how to read or write? Unbelievable. But it happens. And it happens in religion and in Christianity as well. We can't fail the next generation. Eternity hangs in the balance. We have to teach our children and pass the baton on to them. Our responsibility is great. I think of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7, where the Apostle Paul said, that gospel, God put it in earthen vessels. That's hard for me to get my mind around. That's something, the power of God unto salvation, that God would not just by his own just like whisper in our ear and say, Steve, you're now a sinner. Let me tell you what you need to do. This is too important to mess up. But God trusts us enough to put the gospel in earthen vessels, and we have been given the responsibility to take that message to the world. What an awesome responsibility. How humbling that God would even trust me with that. Listen, when my children were little, I wouldn't trust them with some precious thing. They're too prone to stumble. Sure as the world, if I gave it to them, they'd trip and fall and break it. But God knows that we're prone to stumble, but he still entrusted us with the gospel. Sometimes there are passages that we read right over and we miss the significance of it. We might want to get a thing or two out of the verse, and we get those things and we move on and we leave the rest of it behind, and there's still meat on the bone, so to speak. In Ephesians chapter 1, at the very end of the chapter, beginning in verse 22, the Apostle Paul said he put all things under his feet, made everything, him to be head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills all in all. And we read that, okay, church is the body's the church. Jesus is the head of the body. We get our 2 points and we leave. But there's more there than just verbiage. Have you ever you know what lawyerese is? Sometimes you read all this stuff and it's just like, oh, wow, it's verbiage. And sometimes we read the Bible the same way. I got my 2 points, and then the rest is just words, and we move on. But listen to what he says. He's the head of the body, which is his church, the fullness of him. The church is the fullness of him who fills all in all. You know what I have a really hard time saying? I almost choke on the words. It's this: God needs me. That doesn't flow very well. Now, if I said, I need God, now I'll say that all day long. But for me to say, God needs me, that's hard to say. But that's exactly what that verse is saying. Oh, he doesn't need me intrinsically. He existed long before without me, and he didn't need me in that sense. But he has chosen to need me and to need you to fulfill what he's all about. He has placed in us his gospel in earthen vessels. And he said, I want you to pass this along to others. And if I don't do that, I fail God. And in whatever extent that my influence might have reached, Christ also fails because of my failure. That's some stuff to think about. I don't want to fail God, and I certainly, want to honor and respect him for entrusting me with so much. But if I don't pass the baton, I have failed Christ. I've heard it said oftentimes when we talk about, the Christian and the race and stuff, and brethren would say, well, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Haven't you heard that? The Christian race is a marathon. Well, yeah, it is. It's not just a sprint. But, there may be even a better, or at least as equally a good illustration that addresses another aspect of Christianity. But Christianity is a relay where we run a while and we're expected to hand off to somebody else. And when we're gone, they continue to run. And that's what I want to talk about this afternoon. I want to impress upon us our need to pass on to others what we know and the grace that we have experienced in our lives. I came out here last year to speak at the preacher training camp. It was my first time here, and when I got home, I had an email from a woman I had never met before. I don't know where she's from. And she just said, I saw somewhere that you had been out to Oklahoma to talk about preaching to a bunch of young guys. Shouldn't you just trust God to use their life and give them wisdom? And you spent a lot of money going out there, or a lot of money from the church to go out there. Shouldn't you just leave them alone and let God take care of those that want to serve Him? Well, the short answer is no. I thought about writing that back. But the longer answer has to do with 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2. Did not Paul entrust Timothy with the gospel and then turn around and tell Timothy, now listen, what I have entrusted in you, you now go teach others, faithful men, and entrust them with the gospel. Listen, I believe in training preachers. That's why we left. We were in Glasgow, Kentucky for 21 years, and I was preaching, and I loved the congregation there and loved the work there. But when I had the opportunity to go and to train preachers as a part of my preaching, I can preach to 450 people every Sunday, or I can teach a couple dozen guys in a Bible class through the week who go out and each preach to 450 people. I can reach a whole lot more people that way through my influence and my work. And so, we have work to do. There's a job to be done. And lest you say, and sometimes this happens with reference to evangelism. Oh, there we go, evangelism again. That's just not my talent. I'll do a lot of things, but I'm just not going to evangelize. Well, you know what that's about like? That's about like saying when Sunday morning comes around and we have the Lord's Supper here and we go, the Lord's Supper, that's not my talent. Quiet contemplation, my mind goes 100 miles an hour. I just don't do that well, so I'm just going to skip the Lord's Supper. Would anybody contend that? Well, of course not. Because we're commanded to take the Lord's Supper. It's not an option. It's not a talent. It's a command. And evangelism is not a talent. It's a command. And we all ought to be a part of that. There are people in this world who love God and who are groping in darkness, and they need someone to show them the light. And there are people in our pews each week who are Christians who need to be empowered and encouraged and emboldened and strengthened to carry the baton when our journey here is over. I want to give you a few things that will help us to pass the baton along to others. The first thing is this. We need to decide what we want our legacy to be. What do you want to pass on to other people? If you don't make that decision, you're not going to pass on what you want to pass on. You don't just say, I'm 35 years old. I've had the hardest time trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. I think I'll be a doctor. It doesn't work that way, does it? Man, you have to set that goal out a long time earlier, or at least if you do at 35, you still have a long road ahead of you before you ever get to do what you want to do. You have to choose what your legacy is going to be. I sat in church one day when there were people who were being disciplined, actually. We mentioned discipline earlier. But I sat in church, and I was sitting by a boy who was a high school guy. I was high school at the time. And they were reading off the names of some people who were being disciplined. And he leaned over to me and he said, "Hey, Steve, that'll be me in 10 years. I thought, oh, what a terrible thing to say. He had already decided, I know that's where my life is going to head. And sure enough, it did. You have to decide what kind of legacy you want to pass on. And then, you have to live it. You have to engage what you want. You have to live out that legacy that you want to live. There's one of the most interesting statements in Numbers chapter 23. Numbers chapter 23 and verse 10 talks about the prophet Balaam. You remember him. It was an ungodly prophet, but the king, Barak, wanted him to prophesy against Israel and condemn them and curse them. And he said, well, I can't do that. I can only do what the Lord wants me to do. And the Lord said, bless Israel. And so he did. And the king said, well, wait, I don't want to hear you bless them. I want you to curse them. And instead of saying, listen, these are God's people, I'm not going to curse them, he petitioned God again. Like, well, let me double check. Maybe God will change his mind and I can get some money out of this. He was an ungodly man, used in the New Testament as an example of ungodliness. But you know what he says in Numbers chapter 23 and verse 10? He prays a prayer that is one of the craziest prayers that have ever been prayed. He said, Lord, let me die the death of the righteous, and let my end be like his. Well, now that's not a crazy prayer. That's noble. But it's crazy when you won't live it. He wants to die the death of the righteous, but he doesn't want to live the life of a righteous man. He wants his end to be that of heaven, the end that righteous men will have, but he wasn't willing to live it himself. And so in that sense, that's a crazy request to make to God. Ask him to save you and then live as you please. If we are going to pass the baton to somebody, we have to live out, we have to have something to pass on to them. What good is it if we come to the end of the race and we go to pass on, and what do we have to pass on? What is there? We have to live it out. Our children have to see us live it out. Our friends have to see us live it out so that when we leave, that they know what children are. There's so many lessons in children. Learn from them. I know why Jesus said, or among the reasons why Jesus said, let the little children come to me. Man, they're full of glimpses of God. And I remember one time I was in the car. A van is a great place. There are so many theological things you learn in a van with kids. I was sitting in the car one day, and my daughter, my oldest daughter, she was, 4 or 5 years old at the time. And we were outside the bank. My wife was inside, and one of those armored cars, Brinks trucks, pulls up, and they're unloading all this money. And I decided to have a little fun with my daughter and test her. And I said, hey, Kelly, you see that truck there? That's full of money. I think I'm going to go out and bop that guy on the head and take that money. And she said, Daddy, you can't do that. And I said, why not? And I was waiting for, he'll shoot you, or you'll go to jail, or, some kind of an answer like that. You know what the answer was? Daddy, you can't do that. That would make God sad. Man. See, theology in a car. I was as proud as a father could be that day, because she had been listening to us, and we were instilling within her the kind of ethics that we want her to have, and the basis for those ethics. It's not because you'll get in trouble. It's because it would disappoint God. The people who contact us and interact with us in our daily life, they need to see those kind of connections lived out in our lives. We need to choose who will carry on our legacy. To whom are you going to pass that baton? If I were to ask you right now, do you have somebody that you mentor? Tell me somebody that you are mentoring right now. And I've asked that in preachers' meetings before, and people go, yeah, I mentor a lot of people. There's, I do this and this and this. And I'm not talking about broad swipes. I'm not talking about, being friendly to 24 people. I'm talking about intentional, purposeful, picking a person and say, I want you to be someone that I invest myself in. Do you have somebody like that? If you're thinking and you're trying to come up with a name and you haven't come up with one like immediately, then you're not talking about what I'm talking about. You may be doing a lot of good for a lot of people, but I want you to intentionally and purposefully pick someone to carry on or to whom you would pass the baton. And then pass it. It's hard. Sometimes we can't let go. Sometimes we get to the point where we need to hand things off and we just, man, I've done this for so long. I can't hand this off. That means I won't have. There's a great example in 2 Samuel. David fought a giant, right? We know the story, but you may not know this one. Did you know he fought 2 giants? We all know Goliath, and maybe the reason we know that is because it was so glorious. He just one stone and bam, it's over. The power of God. This one isn't so noble. In 2 Samuel, we read of another giant that David does battle with. This giant, his name is Ishbi-Benob. And if you want to challenge me on the pronunciation, feel free to do so. I have no idea. But it's something like that. It's a big, long name, but not quite as long as Higginbotham. But David got into this battle with Ishbi-Benob, who was Goliath's brother. And the Bible says that David grew faint. It wasn't one stone to the forehead, done this time. The brother thought to have killed David. And were it not for his friend Abishai, who came and rescued him and killed that giant, David would have lost his life that day on the battlefield. He would have failed in that battle with the giant. And so the people gathered together after the victory, and they set David in the midst of them and said, David, man, you're not going to fight with us anymore. Because if you were to die, and you know how close we came today? If you were to die, you would quench the light of Israel. Now, question. Basically what they're saying, David, is when we go fight next time, you're not coming with us. You're staying home. We're not taking you. And David could have copped an attitude and said, oh, wow, of what value am I now? I've fought giants all my life. I've been out there in the midst and, hand to hand. I've been in the... Now you're telling me I can't do it? What's the point in living? I've had preachers say that very thing to me before. They got to a point where they really couldn't function like they used to function, and they had reached a point where they needed to pass the baton, but they wouldn't let go. And when it was taken from them forcibly, they're like, well, there's no sense in me going on. Just let me go ahead and die. Sometimes our roles of service change. And we need to do that. And we need to embrace others who are rising and pass the baton to them and let them run and continue the race. We've run our leg. Now we can work in other areas, but let him do that. If you would, we'll close with this. Turn in your Bibles to Numbers chapter 27. And I want you to see an example of what we ought to be doing in our churches today. It doesn't matter if you're an elder, a preacher, a member of the church, a mother, a father, whatever. You need to pass the baton to somebody. I know there are women in Carnes who quilt. It's almost a lost art. But they have taken young ladies in the congregation, and they have classes together. and they quilt together. And pass that on, and cooking, and all those kind of things where you do things in service to God, and you say, I want to invest in you so that you can do this as well. In Numbers chapter 27, Moses is about to select Joshua to be the next leader of Israel. He's about to pass the baton. And I want you to see three things that take place in this handoff. Begin reading with me in verse 16. Let the Lord, the God of spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation who may go out before them and go in before them, who may lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep which have no shepherd. And the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua, the son of Nun, with you, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. When you pass the baton, make sure the person that you're passing it to knows exactly what you're doing. Joshua knew that Moses was passing his leadership to him. It wasn't something he had to figure out on his own. It was deliberate and it was obvious. And if you find someone in your life, you pick that person that you can mentor, that you can pass the baton to. You pick them out and you let them know, I have chosen you. I trust you. I think that much of you, that I think you're the person, and I want to invest my life in you. If you let them know, do you know what that'll do to that person? Do you know how that'll make them feel? They'll have a sense of obligation, a sense of expectation and accountability to you. And you know, they can't just brush it off. They know that someone thinks that much of them, and they're going to rise, no doubt, to the challenge of that. Pass the baton to somebody, pick somebody, and let them know, this is my intention with you. I want to invest myself in you so that when I'm gone, you can carry on. I want to help you do that. Notice the second thing that takes place. Set him before Eleazar the priest, and before all the congregation, and inaugurate him in their sight. Not only do you need to let the person know to whom you're handing off and passing this baton, you need to let everybody know, I'm invested in this person. I'm on his side. Don't mess with him. This is someone I think a lot of. And that will give, it'll give him, strength and boldness, and it'll protect him from those who would detract from him. You know, a number of years ago, I was at a ball game. I had just advanced to another level of baseball with my friend and I, and we were at a game, and there was a guy pitching, and we were sitting in the stands, and we were going, oh, that guy doesn't have anything. You know, he's got a weak arm. We would be killing him if we were playing. And we were doing all that kind of talk. Oh, he can't throw a fastball. He can't throw a curveball. And we were just doing, and then all of a sudden we got tapped on the shoulder. And this woman behind me said, that's my son you're talking about. Oh, if there was a hole, you know, it would have been filled with me. I felt about that big. And you know what? After I knew that was her son, I never said another word about that boy the rest of the game. And sometimes people get a little jealous and they get a little cynical and they want to pick at people. But listen, when you make it known, I'm invested in, I trust this guy. I'm on his side. We are a partner, a team. You're going to back those people off of him. And that's exactly what he needs. And then here's the third and final thing. And you shall give some of your authority to him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient. Moses shared responsibility. And don't you know that would have lifted him up? Wow, Moses trusts me. You know, when I remember the day I became a man, I was probably 8 years old. Let me tell you how it happened. My mom was cooking, And I heard tears and wailing and all this stuff from the kitchen. She had burned the meat, had all kind of interruptions, and there was only just a couple pieces that were salvaged. And she was so upset about that dinner. And so Dad privately pulled me into their bedroom, and he said, listen, Mom burned meat, as you obviously heard, and there's not enough to go around for supper tonight. So can we have a man-to-man talk? A man-to-man? I was 8 years old. Yeah, I was all in for that. Man-to-man, yes. I have been invited to manhood. And I said, absolutely. And my dad said, listen, when the plate is passed to you tonight, as men, we're just going to pass it on. And we're going to let your mom and your sister have that meat. All right. I couldn't wait till supper came, and I sat there, and that meat was passed to me, and man, I was never more proud. I would never have handed my sister I'd take the last one normally, but there was an invitation to manhood attached to this. And so I passed it right on to my sister, and man, that was one of the proudest moments in my life. But my dad called me and shared responsibility with me, and it lives with me to this day. When we pass the baton, I think we need to do those three things. Let someone in your life know, I love you and I trust you, and I want to invest my life in yours so that when I'm dead and gone, you can live on. And I want other people to know that and make it clear to others and let them see that you have invested in that person, and you start sharing responsibility with that person. And you'll make a difference. And there won't be a generation that arises that does not know God. Into our hands, the gospel is given. The question is, before we leave this life, to whom will we have handed that off and passed on to others?